When I begin working with clay, I like to have a canvas underneath of my workstation. This allows to keep the clay from sticking to the surface of the table. You're also going to notice that I take a wet sponge or a damp sponge, or I spray down my surface with a spray bottle of water. If my canvas is too dry, my clay will stick to it. Having just a little bit of moisture, just a little bit, will allow my canvas to not dry out my clay and continue to allow me have a nice working surface. When working with clay, it is imperative that you understand that when clay is open and sitting out, it gets dried out and then it becomes useless. We need our clay in the plastic stage so it is nice and workable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get myself out a section of clay. I noticed that this clay is way too big for me, so I'm getting out a fettling knife and I'm going to cut some of that clay off. Immediately, the clay I do not use, I'm going to put back in the bag. I'm going to wrap that bag up as tight as I can, and then I'm going to put it back in the middle of the table for my classmates to share. I want you to understand that if these are not closed up, they will dry out. When I go to make my actual coil, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of shape the coil or the clay into just this log type shape. This shape is going to allow me to start my coil. Notice that when I'm making my coil, I start in the middle of the clay and I move my hands in an outward direction. This allows me to do it slowly and consistently. As I continue to work, there are a couple of things that you might notice that I do to keep my coils consistent. First of all, if I'm rolling unevenly, do you see how this one end gets thin in one spot and it's going to start flip-flopping as I roll my clay? I want to stop that as soon as I notice it. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to tap down my clay. Whenever I realize that it's getting almost flat and like an oval shape, I'll tap it down on the one side so that it becomes a little bit more flat or round. Also, if my clay starts getting too long for me to control, I'll cut it in half and I'll roll the coil out on one side and then I will do the other half. This allows me to have better control. Here again, you will see me taking my clay and actually tapping it down to make it a little bit smoother. When I am done with this coil, I want to check that its thickness is about the thickness of my finger. The thickness of my finger will allow me to create a coil that is consistent. It won't be too thin that when I go to put the entire thing and attach it together, that it won't be so thin that it doesn't actually work, or too thick that it'll weigh everything below it down and make your piece sag. Now that I have a nice long coil ready to go, I'm going to make my base. I'm going to start with one end and I'm just going to coil the piece around itself, and I'm going to apply a slight pressure to make sure that there are no gaps. I might smooth out pieces as I go. If I see that it is starting to crack, I can also add a little bit of slip to it to keep those cracks from getting bigger. So I'm going to quickly roll in my coil and I'm going to check to see how well I'm doing and if the size is accurate. And to do this, I use my template. So I'm going to grab my template and check for my 3-inch base because I know that on my template I was supposed to have a 3-inch base. So I'm going to hold the template up and I'm going to check and make sure, yes, this really is right about 3 inches. But if I turn the clay, I'll notice that I might need to see if it's 3 inches on a different side as well. So what I determined is that I actually, on accident, picked the perfect amount of clay when normally I would have probably had to cut some off. Since I'm happy with the size that I have created, I'm going to take the end of the clay and I'm going to smooth it into itself so that it looks like it is one continuous piece of clay. As I complete this step, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to get rid of the coils on the inside because I don't want to see those coils. I start to smooth them out with my finger and I realize that it's not going to work very well. So I'm going to grab my slip and I'm actually going to use some of this slip to help fill in some of those cracks to make sure there's no air bubbles trapped inside of there and to help me have this clay nice and moist and workable. Notice it is the goop on the bottom of the slip that is the actual slip. It's not the water on the top. That's just like a dirty water. You need to get the actual goop out from down inside of that container. Once I've applied some of the slip, it becomes significantly easier to smooth those coils out and to get rid of those tiny little coil details. I'm going to do this on the front side. Then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to do the same thing onto the back. That way it looks like it is one solid piece of clay. The last thing that I want to point out while I'm doing this is that I keep my fingers on the outside and make sure that I don't accidentally compress the circle so that it is a wrong or different shape. Now that I am completely finished with my circle and smoothing out the coils, I'm going to again check and make sure that it is the right size based off of my template. If I move the circle around, I'm checking to make sure it's not an oval and that as I move it, it really does match the size of the base of my template. Finally, to complete this step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a basic pencil. I can use a regular number 2 pencil, or I can use a mechanical pencil without the lead being out. I'm going to write my first and last name and my class period on this. This now becomes the bottom of my coil pilt vessel, and when I flip it over, I know that my name is on the bottom of my piece at all times, and it's going to be nice and legible.